Başak Çalı from the law school, and I'm going to talk a little bit about my ongoing research. It is not yet completed on human rights law in the Gulf Cooperation Council. This research is ongoing, and I'm part of a research team to carry out this. I'm the lead principal investigator, but I have colleagues from other universities as well. This research is interesting for a number of reasons. One of the reasons that I find it interesting is that it is the first human rights law research that is funded by the Qatar National Research Council, which is the equivalent of TÜBİTAK in Turkey or the ESRC in the United Kingdom. So we will see how it goes when we report our findings at the end of this, because this hasn't been tested before. It's a very explicit research that focuses on the effects of human rights law commitment in these countries. So I have, excuse me, a team of scholars. So the research is led by me here, but I have colleagues from Oxford and Qatar University and Georgetown University in Doha who are also jointly carrying out this research. I wanted to present this at this little seminar because it is actually interdisciplinary research in and of itself. I'm trained as a lawyer and a political scientist myself. My colleague from Oxford is a lawyer. My colleague from Georgetown is a political scientist and a Middle Eastern expert. So you can imagine when we have our team meetings, it takes a lot of time that we actually get together to talk about what we're talking about. But we have learned quite a lot from one another throughout this process. So I don't know how much you know about the GCC. Maybe just to link into Professor Barlas's talk, this is the EU of the Gulf. The Gulf Cooperation Council is actually modeled after the EU. The Gulf countries said, well, if they have the EU, why not? We can have something else. And this is how the GCC was established. And these are my countries. This is when we look at human rights law in the GCC, we are looking at Saudi Arabia, called the big brother of the GCC in terms of size and in terms of political influence, and the other states who are in the GCC in the Gulf Cooperation Council are Kuwait, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Oman. For odd historical reasons, Yemen has not been included. Jordan recently applied to be a member of the GCC and was rejected. So it is a union that likes to keep a very tight knit of members. So there are 6 countries within the GCC. Within these, of course, there are very, very different countries from one another. That was one little mistake that I may have committed when I started doing this research. I thought they would be very similar. And of course, they're incredibly different countries in terms of their political histories. They have similar problems in terms of gender rights or rights of migrant workers, but similarities really stop there. They're very different. Oman is a very old, independent, historic kingdom. 1932 is the unification of Saudi Arabia, but all the other tiny micro-states are, of course, leftovers from the British Empire. Kuwait became independent only in 1961, and the other little micro-states became independent in 1971. So we're talking about some very young new states as well as 2 historic kingdoms. And in terms of their rule of law,
Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and UAE, and we know part of Saudi Arabia was part of the Ottoman Empire.
yes.
You said Oman was never part of.
No, Oman was not under even British protectorate.
Were the others part of the Ottomans, or were they sort of quasi?
Well, Turkey had special relationships, I think, with Saudi Arabia. I mean, I don't think they were completely under the power. But yes, I think in the case of Kuwait, Bahrain and Qatar, yes, they were that. But Saudi Arabia has also a unique history. There's a unification of it because it was divided into different sections. But as we know it as a modern state, we say 1932 of unification of the 2 regions. Now, of course, one thing that joins these countries together are they're very rich countries. They have discovered oil in the 1930s, and the whole development, maybe the whole story in these jurisdictions have changed significantly because they are very well-developed countries. Qatar has the highest GDP per capita in all over the world in the UNDP rankings. These are very rich, very prosperous countries for, well, thanks to their national resources. Now, in our research question, being an assembly of lawyers and political scientists, and we're interested in human rights law, we actually I ask three very basic questions. They are very basic questions in the sense that they are questions that both political scientists and human rights lawyers ask on a regular basis. So one question that we ask about the GCC states is, why are they voluntarily signing up to United Nations human rights treaties? So why are they taking on legal commitments on issues of human rights? Obviously, one thing I haven't mentioned, I think you all know, these are all authoritarian states. They are kingdoms. They are emirships. And so the political participation is not something we will talk about in these countries. So we're curious as to why they sign human rights treaties, which generally represent a very liberal and a very democratic agenda in and of themselves. So why would the GCC states do that? The second question we have is, okay, when they do sign up to these treaties, what happens next? What happens when these states voluntarily accept legal commitments at the United Nations? How does it trickle down into these countries is the second basic question that we ask. And the third one is a very standard political science question maybe. We try to understand what mechanisms, what kind of processes lead to domestic changes, if there's any changes, when they sign up to these very high United Nations human rights treaties. So what we did in order to answer these questions is what we use what is a mixed methods approach. We look at all of their commitments, we look at how they report on their human rights situations, we look at their legislation, what kinds of changes have happened in their legislation. So there's lots of quantitative, descriptive sort of analysis we're looking at in order to capture, once they signed a human rights treaty, before and after, whether things have changed in terms of whether they have aligned their commitments to what they signed up to. The second part, which I'm more involved in, because that's more of my training, is we do elite interviews to answer some of these why questions. You can't look at the data to answer those questions. So I've been on the road in the Gulf, and a colleague of mine said, this is impossible. You're a Turk, you don't speak Arabic. What are you doing? This is a very impossible research. Though I found my Arabic vocabulary is fantastic, because Turkish has a lot of Arabic words. And what I found is, being a Turk worked perfectly in very positive ways in this field work, rather than being an American or somebody else. I was felt close enough, but not a real insider. And it actually did help with having very genuine interviews with elites. They thought that they could trust me, but I wasn't too much of an insider. So it actually worked, we think, to my advantage. My other colleague is from Iran. They said 2 women, a Turkish and an Iranian, going to the Gulf. We actually thought it was a win-win choice of countries. So I'll just tell you very briefly about what the literature says about these things. Why do states, forget the Gulf states, why would Turkey or the United States of America, why would they sign up to human rights treaties? And there are a number of theories out there, and I'm just throwing them at you. There are some very skeptical ones. The skeptical one is all lost in my slide. It is about material gain. Poor countries sign up because hoping they will get some money from the Norwegians or from the Swedish. It's a very common pattern for least developed countries. Without doing any research in the Gulf, we would know that they won't do that for material gain. These are the richest countries in the world, so that would be completely not something we should look for. Neighborhood effects, you will sign something because all European states signed up to it and it doesn't look very good. In this neighborhood, nobody's really human rights champions. There's not a lot of human rights signing up to treaties. Maybe that's not the thing. The right thing to do, because you believe in the principles enshrined. Now there are structural difficulties because these are monarchies, so it will be very hard for them to sign up to freedom of expression or freedom of assembly kind of commitments because of how they govern these places, commitment to the norms. So these are some theories about why any state would ratify. Pressure is another one linked to material gain, and no one really pressures the Gulf states to ratify. So once states actually do ratify, how do things change in a country? This is something we know from Turkey. Turkey ratifies a lot, but not many things change. We signed 9 out of 8 of United Nations human rights treaties, which is a very impressive number of commitments. And if you compare our country situation, maybe it's a different story. The biggest mechanisms of effect, domestic effect, are judiciary-driven, that you have very strong judiciaries, or you have very strong civil society groups that will be driving these effects. You might have interstate pressure, some countries that will push you for changes. And the challenges with doing research in the Gulf is that there are no even proper association laws. You cannot legally set up NGOs in some of these places. They are very heavily restricted. So the civil society, to have civil society, you have to have a legal background. That does not exist. The judiciaries are not independent. There is a structural problem with that. And there is not a lot of interstate pressure on the Gulf states from the outsiders. The biggest ally of the Gulf states is the United States, and United States does not ratify human rights treaties. So it wouldn't advocate change through those treaties because it is not what that big state actually does. So some of my colleagues said, well, do you have to go to the Gulf in order to do this research? This is isn't this a bit of a waste of time? Isn't this a very obvious thing? We will expect only sort of they're showing off. It's a photo shoot opportunity in Geneva, saying, you know, oh, we're also a good state, and then they will do absolutely nothing. This is what we will expect from the Gulf states. We insisted that sometimes, even to state the obvious, you have to do some research, because no one ever does research on the Gulf states, because everyone thinks it's the lost cause. You know, what's the point of doing human rights research in the Gulf? So we insisted, and strangely got funded to do the research. So that's where we are. So just to give you a very quick picture about the UN human rights treaties, there are 9 core human rights treaties within the United Nations. They look at women, migrant workers, children, torture, civil and political rights, economic and social rights, disability, enforced disappearances. And Turkey has ratified 8 out of 9, for example. These are voluntary commitments, completely voluntary for states to accept these commitments. But when they accept these commitments, they can actually opt out from the obligation. So if you have a package of 20 rights, you can say, I'd like to sign up to this treaty, but 20 minus 2. I'm going to make a reservation to 2 of these rights, but the rest I would like to accept. So the states do enter reservations. This is a system that we have in the international global scene. So,
excuse me, for my curiosity, what is the law that Turkey did not subscribe to? You said
it's the convention. Yes, it's the Convention on Enforced Disappearances. Is the one that Turkey hasn't ratified yet. It may ratify. I wouldn't see why it wouldn't. But 8 out of 9 is quite a high number of ratifications. A country like Argentina, I usually give the example, is a 9 out of 9 country, for example. They have ratified all of them, and some of the Central African states. So here, I try to do something exciting. I don't know if it works. This shows you, the green shows you the ratification in the Gulf, and the red shows you no ratification in the Gulf. And civil and political rights, okay, I will show you what the reds are. It's about civil and political rights, economic, social, cultural rights, migrant worker rights. So all these that are red are not ratified by the Gulf states, and the Convention on Enforced Disappearances is the one also not ratified. So the Gulf states ratified all treaties concerning torture, protection of women's rights, might find this interesting, elimination of racial discrimination, children's rights, sexual exploitation of children, protection of children in armed conflict. This is really interesting that, this is, just in itself is a descriptive information that this is kind of the commitments that these states actually put into these treaties. And you can see that, of course, anything that has to do with civil and political rights, which is freedom of expression, freedom of association, these are all in the red side because these are the red lines of these states. Freedom of expression, political protest, political speech are anathema to the Gulf governance structure that we have at the moment. So by looking at this picture, one of the things we can say is that when the issues are not threatening for regime stability, if these regimes perceive some issues, children, disability, or women, they tend to actually ratify human rights treaties. Now, I will show you something else just to complement this. This actually shows the amount of reservations that these states enter when they ratify human rights treaties. It's a very detailed slide. I will translate it a little bit for you. So all these states ratify the Women's Rights Convention, but they ratify it with extensive reservations. So this is how it works. So they ratify the Rights of the Child Convention, but with extensive reservations. So they are using the international legal system to opt in, but also opt out at the same time. And these states are regarded as one of the most reserving states within the United Nations system. And some of these reservations are very general. So they would say, we ratify, we sign up to this treaty, but subject to our domestic laws, which in plain English means you really haven't signed up to anything if you're subjecting it to your domestic laws. So the practice is positive on one side, but that if you look at this kind of data, it is a very heavily reserved area. And women's and children's rights are the areas that are reserved most. So just a very brief, if I could, just very brief information or some of the very preliminary findings that we got from the research so far. One of the things that we found in our field research is that these states obviously do very selective ratification with heavy reservations. So it's a pattern that we see in all of the Gulf states, that they sign up, but they reserve quite a lot of the treaty commitments. But contrary to the literature, remember I was saying, everybody was saying, why are you doing this research? It's so obvious, what we will find. One of the things that we found through field work and interviews was that the states are trying to signal outside to the international community that they are not rogue states. They are not North Korea. They are not sort of really outside of the system. They are very traditional. They have monarchies and so on. But this is how they're trying to show to everybody else that they are not completely isolated from the international system. This is something that we find from the interviews. And one critical issue with this is that after the invasion of Kuwait in 1990, the ratifications increased significantly because they are very much threatened by an external invasion, and Kuwait and Bahrain start ratifying quite a lot of the treaties. So it's a signaling to outsiders that we're a little bit unusual, but please regard us like that. The second thing, which was not in the literature that came out from our research, is that there is a domestic signaling game going on in all of these states. There are a lot of progressive groups within these countries, even amongst the elite, even amongst the emir's family or this kingdom's family. And this is an internal dialogue as much as an external dialogue. So the progressives, the ones that would like to do domestic reform, it is very difficult to say, let's reform our kingdom. This will be also a very dangerous thing to say, but it is okay to say, let's ratify a human rights treaty, because it is a very sort of a far away, a distant thing. So this is something that we found quite a lot in Qatar. that it is a fight between the progressive and the more conservative factions within elite groups that lead to signing to human rights commitments. And if you look at the ratifications and reservations, you see the same fight. So they agree on ratification, but the conservative factions say, but we have to make all these reservations if we're going to enter into these systems. So we found both external signaling to everyone else that we are not very, very, very strange, but also internal fights within the progressive governments. Even in Saudi Arabia, this is the most strong way of signaling the ratification of the Convention of the Rights of the Child for the progressives in Saudi Arabia was a revolutionary act. This is how they will explain it. They say this is how we managed to get something. So these are the reformers. This is my last slide. In terms of domestic effects, I think the skeptics of this research were very right. We are finding very, very, very minimal domestic effects of ratification of these human rights treaties. So they're signed, the elites are dealing with their agendas and they're signaling to one another, but when it comes to ratification, it is always around the edges. So only the least of the least controversial issues actually lead on to some change on the ground. And you can see this very obviously. These are very authoritarian, centrally organized institutions with no civil society, with no strong judiciary. It's very difficult to break it unless the emir decides to change the law. There is no, I mean, there are some mechanisms, but not really, if you once you do the field work, that will make anyone to change the law. So there's a very pattern of authoritarian commitment that we find here. One thing that everybody was very proud about was banning child jockeys, for example. They were using small, very, very small children because they're very light in all the horse races. So the Committee on the Rights of the Child said this is inhuman and degrading treatment. You are using underage children for entertainment purposes. And this was picked up by all Gulf states, and they all banned child jockey practices. And now they have robots. I will recommend you to look at YouTube for the robot jockeys that now they use. But this is an example of change, but you could see how it's really around the edges. It doesn't touch the political core of these regimes. One area that there's a lot of implementation, and this will be my final example, is anti-trafficking regulation. It is one of the best regions in the whole planet about anti-trafficking measures, even though there's not a lot of trafficking in this region because of the United States pressure and the pressure that comes from the United States Congress to do things. So when the US pressures, there's actually a lot of mobilization around the elite, but US has only pressures these states on these issues, and anti-trafficking is something that everybody can deal with because it's not about citizens, but other people being trafficked in and out. So this is our sort of coming towards the end of our human rights Gulf research. Thank you. I could take maybe a few questions, but we are all, yes.
Well, what I understood, they ratify like specific treaties such as women concerning women and children, but not the general ones like civil rights issues.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, they ratify issue-specific treaties.
Specific. Then why you think it's more dangerous to ratify treaties, general treaties? Like it can it include? This is what they think that it can include many other things that.
Yes, there are a number of reasons. One is the Civil and Political Rights Treaty has freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, freedom from arbitrary detention. These things are tools that an authoritarian regime uses to manage. So insulting an emir can lead to death penalty. And that's not something you can have together with freedom of expression commitments. They are too wide apart from one another. So yeah, political speech is not allowed in these countries. Yeah. Yes?
I have 3 questions, but I'll just ask one because we don't have much time. In thinking about the Arab uprisings and sort of the GCC crew. He mentioned Jordan had wanted to join. I think Morocco wanted to join at one point too. And people were joking how it was like a monarch club, essentially.
Yeah.
And if you think about that region, like Bahrain is really the only place where you saw kind of real uprising happening.
Yeah.
Do you think, is there any way in sort of very recent history that ratification has coincided with trying to make yourself look like a country where human rights are okay and therefore your citizens or subjects would not have to have an uprising?
Well, you actually nailed it. I didn't mention all the sub-country stories because they are so different from one another. But we saw two negative examples and not maybe positive examples of that. In Bahrain, Bahrain is very different from the others. There's a sectarian divide. The majority of the people are not in the same religion as the ruler, the king of Bahrain. And there's a very unequal distribution of wealth and so on. So here, the government, in order to deflect criticism from the protests, it went to Geneva and ratified quite a lot of treaties. So it wasn't trying to signal domestically, because it wasn't trying to, it wasn't a negotiation with them, but mostly a negotiation or a signaling outside saying, we are okay with human rights, these protesters are a little bit obnoxious and they're doing a lot of things. So I think there was much more external signaling than internal signaling. And very recently the UAE ratified the Torture Convention, and the amount of reports on torture coming out of UAE has exponentially increased since they think that the Muslim Brotherhood is a threat in the UAE. So there's widespread practice of torture. At the same time, they ratified the Convention Against Torture. So that is again a stronger external signaling than an internal one. But there are internal examples as well.
You mentioned the monarchy as sort of a stumbling block for implementation of many of these, but you never mentioned the Sharia laws. Are Sharia laws also on the way? For example, torture, cutting someone's hand because of theft, is it considered a torture or not? And polygamy is another.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So this is how they do it. All of these reservations say that they will implement these treaties so long as they're compatible with Sharia. This is what the reservations tell us. So this is their sort of way of selecting it. In the Saudi Arabian case, this is the much stronger one. They say, as long as we think it's okay, we will. So you could see that it is, the more extensive the reservations, you could see that the progressives have failed to convince the conservatives. And in some countries, the Qatar is the most positive example, where there are a lot less reservations based on Sharia. But if you look at how Sharia reservations are, that really shows us how the reformists or more enlightened Sharia experts, which they also exist, they don't think there's a conflict and you have to interpret Sharia in different ways because they disagree on Sharia as an interpretive law, it's not written law. So there's very much variation on whether it's an obstacle or not. And it is a function of how strong the conservative factions are within the ruling elite. If there are some progressive elements within the ruling families, the Sharia objections start to disappear. And if sometimes when the king or the emir changes, they may come back again. But that's the dynamic in those countries. Thank you.